I am researcher NZ0. Welcome. If you are new here, read the description, stop, and continue. Let us begin.
Shared with the pseudonym Unhel Tristan813.
To begin with, I will mention that my family is highly sensitive to paranormal things, so much so that witchcraft and white magic are practiced openly. For my part, one can see spirits, hear them. Also, specifically, my mother is very good with spells. The first story I want to tell happened to me when I attended high school. At that time, I would have been about 13 years old, and I started to see a little girl in a white dress in the house. I wasn't scared because I only saw her out of the corner of my eye, and when I blinked, the problem started when this girl stroked my head at night and repeatedly told me, "Don't forget me." I decided to ignore that for a while, but it became unbearable because I was no longer only at home during the night. I had even started following me everywhere and at all hours. Being fed up with the situation, I talked to my grandmother, who is very knowledgeable about these issues. She told me that this little girl was not a spirit, but rather an angel. A little girl who had died unjustly in a shooting, and that she just wanted to be with someone who could see her and who could play with her. In the end, my grandmother convinced me to leave the child with me and talk to her. I started to follow this, and we got to a point where I knew that her name was Aurora and that she told things that could happen and affect me. I'm currently 23 years old and I'm used to living with her. She's become part of my life, and everything I'm going to tell happened 7 years ago. My older brother, a friend, and I were coming back from the cinema after seeing the premiere of a movie. I remember we were back around 2 o'clock. As it was late, our friend decided to stay in the house. We arrived and went to my room, which was on the second floor and has a front window facing the street, which is illuminated by a public lamp. We liked the movie so much that we continued talking about it with the lights in the room off, illuminated only by the faint glow that came through the window. Out of nowhere, we began to feel an intense cold that penetrated to the bones, and immediately we saw a woman walking outside the window, something quite absurd. Because we were on the second floor, after the woman passed, footsteps were heard on the ceiling. My brother just said, "Don't go out, that what we saw is a witch and I'm trying to get us out of the room." Just as he finished saying it, female laughter began to be heard. My brother, now more angry than frightened, took out 3 cards with the prayer of the Magnificent. The moment the 3 of us began to read the prayer, that thing let out a shrill shriek. We did not hesitate and continued to pray for about 10 minutes until he stopped shouting and left. We never saw her again. Shared under the pseudonym Diana. 9-1.
My name is Diana, and many paranormal events have happened in my family. We all have several stories, but the one I will tell happened to my younger brother when he was 5 years old. My grandmother had died a short time ago, so her house was totally closed, and although we lived on the same land, we did not have access to her house. One day, my brother got up and began to desperately kick at my grandmother's door. Between tears and screams, he demanded why he didn't open the door and why she didn't want him. We all got out of our minds, and my mom went to see him and told him that she was no longer with us and that she was now in heaven with God. He, completely angry, replied, "You're a liar. Of course here she is." After a while of arguing, my mom asked him why he was so sure about that, and she told him, "Last night he spoke to me and said, 'Son, I'm hungry. Serve me a banana with beans.' That's why I served him a plate and took it to his bedroom and left it on the table next to his bed." Curiously, that same day my uncle came to visit, who was the only one who had the key to that house. My mother told him about the situation, and my aunt told us, "Well, we are all going in," and so the child gets rid of the idea that his grandmother is no longer with us and that it was only a dream that he had. We all went into my grandmother's house, and my brother drove us exactly to where the plate that he had left the night before was. My mom passed him the finger of beans that were fresh. We were all surprised and a little scared, since obviously there was no way my brother would have entered the house and just left that plate. Definitely a pretty rare experience. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Shared with the pseudonym Oscar Bermudez. 8.
It was October 2016. I was alone because my parents and my siblings had left the house for a few days. It would be about 30 minutes to midnight. I turned off all the lights in my room and I was lying down when I heard 5 knocks on the door. I immediately went outside to see who it was and I thought it was my parents, that they had arrived. But it wasn't like that. I went back to bed and then they knocked. But this time in my room. It took me a while to make up my mind and finally I got up. But as I did so, a very dark shadow passed, very close to the lintel of my door, which gave me an absolute chill that gave me goosebumps. I went to bed and about 20 minutes passed when suddenly a black cat with white patches started scratching my window, since where we live is a bit mountainous. I was very scared because I had never seen a cat in the area, and here where I live and the houses are a little removed from each other. I found the whole event really strange. Especially those hours and with that mysterious attitude. Shared under the pseudonym Nancy de la Rosa. 628.
This happened to my husband when we were still dating. It was in the month of October about 15 years ago, and I was approximately 17. We lived in separate villages, and he went to see me every third day. On one of those occasions it got a little dark, so he said goodbye and proceeded to leave, but it turns out that since it was corn season, my mom told him to take some, so he put them in his backpack and said goodbye and left. About 3 minutes after he took the road, we heard the breathing of an agitated person. It seemed that he wanted to scream, but he couldn't, so we ran out and it was him, my boyfriend. He was all frightened, about to faint. I ran to him and asked him what was wrong or what was wrong with him, but he couldn't speak. We took him to the bedroom and waited for him to calm down a bit. When he calmed down a little, he began to tell us that when he left the house he wanted to light a cigarette to smoke it from the road, but bending down to pass a fence that divides the land. Taking out his lighter, something or someone turned it off. He turned it back on, and what was his surprise that in front of him was a woman all in black, with her hair covering her face. He straightened up, backed away quickly, but what he was talking about, the backpack itself where he had carried the corn, decided to run towards the house. But that woman was chasing them. All this happened to him at about 11 p.m. My parents decided that he couldn't go home under those conditions, so he stayed that night to sleep at my house. We've been married for 8 years now, and we're still wondering what the hell that was, but he doesn't like to talk much about it. Because he says that when he remembers it, he gets an immense fear, because he says that it is something that he will never forget. Shared with the pseudonym Diego Angel. 4-5.
I was coming home from work as usual. At 1 or 2 o'clock on the way back, he was forced to pass by a house that always has the lights on at all hours. But that day, curiously enough, they were off. It seemed strange to me, and I went to the car to look out of one of the windows. In the distance I could see some lights and candles of some people dancing, and I kept looking at them, things that I regret, because they all immediately turned to look at me and I felt a piercing chill. The people had a frightening face and stared at me. Luckily for me, I left the engine running and got in quickly and left the place. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I realized that one of the people set me a high speed, but by the time I tasted it was gone. When the woman who was to be my wife arrived, she asked me what had happened because I was quite pale, but I decided not to tell her anything about what had happened. Shared with the pseudonym Katie Martinez. 325.
Since I was little, I have always been accompanied by strange things. Just to give an example, when I cried, my crib moved. Faced with this, my mother took me to a lady to heal me. She said that this happened because the witches wanted to take me, since he had noticed that I had a strong aura, so in order for them to leave me alone, the lady said that I should distract her, but for this she asked my mother to make an offering, to bring flowers, dishes, water, and sweets. Besides, he had to take me out of that house, and they left me at my grandmother's house, who was practically the one who raised me. The bad thing happened about 6 years later. Right in the darkness on the side of the well, I found a large German Shepherd type dog that was following me with his gaze. His presence was really amazing. There was no way he was in there, because everything was parked. I wasn't afraid, but I walked away without turning my back on him. When I got to the house, I told my aunt what had happened, and she sprinkled holy water, and I didn't see him again. I always lived with my grandmother and my uncle Matthias, and we lived on a huge piece of land. I liked to visit an aunt who lived next to my house. On her land, there were too many large trees, such as cedars, plums, orange, and avocados. Having so much vegetation and being a small house, it was very easy for me to go and see it. Since I was the only girl in the house, she also liked me to visit her. One day I was a little late. I went to see her, and when I arrived, I heard some little voices that were talking to me. At the same time, I couldn't understand what they were saying to me. They only sounded like children. I quickly thought that maybe it was some neighbors who had come. The voices came from behind a cedar tree, but when I went, I didn't see anyone. My aunt, then somewhat annoyed, came out asking me what I was doing in that place. She took me by the hand. She went to leave me with my grandmother, but the strangest thing is that on the way they began to throw pebbles at us. We never knew what happened, but now I understand that maybe it was goblins. I don't know yet, or at least that's my theory.
Shared under the pseudonym Sophie Vasquez. 8482.
What I am going to tell me was told to me by my aunt's friend. She had 3 children, and on one occasion, the youngest of them was on vacation, so she went to visit her grandmother, her mother. The days she arrived, she went with her friends to fish, and when they were in the river, all the boys saw a shadow on the other side of the stream. They started screaming because the shadow was coming in their direction. They started running, but their son had forgotten the shirt, and when he tried to come back for it, the shadow was standing there on the side, so obviously it wasn't for her. That day she returned home and told her mother what had happened, and she told her that nothing would happen. That night she could not sleep, because she said that the shadow of the river was in her room. The next day she was out of her house, and a boy who was her friend came and offered her to go to another city that is about 2 hours away from there on a motorcycle, that they would come back that same day, to which he accepted. But unfortunately, when they came back, they had an accident, and he fell into a ravine before his mother found out about the accident. She heard her son enter the house, go up the stairs, and even followed him to call him, but there was no one. He also mentions that the smell of his perfume was all over the house. After a while, the friend's father came to tell her that his son had had an accident, that he had died. She couldn't believe it because she had felt the presence in her house, and she also swore that she had heard it. She still thinks that her son went to say goodbye, and somehow I think the same.
Follow us, subscribe, and share on YouTube. This helps me continue with this project. Give your opinion. In the description you will find the emails to send your stories in case you like to share them. I appreciate your preference. Until the next episode. Latin macabre stories and more.